Welcome back to the Blood Cancers Blitz Roadmap of Acute Myeloid Leukemias. In our journey-based approach, we have already begun to learn the landscape by elucidating myeloid versus lymphoid, leukemia versus lymphoma, acute versus chronic. We also turn to the 10 tools, reflecting on analysis target and analysis type. Now, step 3. We will make mental maps. Where in the Hemepath world will we begin our journey? In the world of acute myeloid leukemias. As we begin, let's start with a hierarchy of diagnostic terms. Myeloid neoplasms is a broad reaching term that encompasses acute myeloid leukemias, myelodysplastic neoplasms, myeloproliferative neoplasms, and myelodysplastic myeloproliferative neoplasms. Today we focus on acute myeloid leukemias. Challenge from yesterday was to think of how many acute myeloid leukemias you're aware of. How many did you find? Here is my master list based off of the WHO 5 classification. The ICC classification is fairly similar. Let's analyze this together. But first, take a deep breath. We will look for patterns. This is one of the key skills that pathologists have of looking for patterns. We often apply that skill to cells, but for now, let's apply it to the diagnoses and diagnostic terms themselves. What do you see? Pause the video and consider any patterns. You may notice that there are many that show the word fusion or rearrangement, such as there, and there. If we combine all these together, we can create a category of genetically defined acute myeloid leukemias. These include the acute myeloid leukemias proper, which include AML with PML-RAR fusion, or APL, acute myeloid leukemia with RUNX1, RUNX1T1 fusion, CBFB, MyH11 fusion, DEC-NUP 214 fusion, RBM15 MRTFA fusion, BCR-ABL1 fusion, KMT2A rearrangement, MECOM rearrangement, NUP98 rearrangement, NPM1 mutation, CBPA mutation, myelodysplasia related, and other defined genetic alterations. We can also include in this category the myeloid lymphoid neoplasms with eosinophilia. I include these because they can also present with increased myeloid blasts. And these include the myeloid lymphoid neoplasms with PDGFRA rearrangement, PDGFRB rearrangement, FGFR1 rearrangement, JAK2 rearrangement, FLT3 rearrangement, and ETV6-ABL1 fusion, and other tyrosine kinase fusions. We can also include in this category the mixed phenotype acute leukemias, as they can present with increased myeloid blast. These include mixed phenotype acute leukemia with BCR-ABL1 fusion, KMT2A rearrangement, and ambiguous lineage with other defined genetic alterations. Notice that all three of these big blocks of acute myeloid leukemias include a space for other defined genetic alterations or other tyrosine kinase gene fusions. This is to recognize that the classification systems, such as the WHO, are works in progress, and we might not know all of the defining rearrangements or fusions for acute myeloid leukemia. However, in the future, we may discover additional ones. We go back to our master list. just grouping by fusions and rearrangements describes a great amount of the acute myeloid leukemias. Let's look for other patterns. You can see here, and here, and here, that a number of the acute myeloid leukemias show descriptive terms in the names, either defined by differentiation or by immunophenotype. If we put these together, we can define another category with immunomorphologic features. There are 11 in this grouping. Acute myeloid leukemia with minimal differentiation, acute myeloid leukemia without maturation, acute myeloid leukemia with maturation, acute basophilic leukemia, acute myelomonocytic leukemia, acute monocytic leukemia, acute erythroid leukemia, and acute megakaryoblast leukemia. If you have a attending who has been around for a while, they might refer to these morphologic classifications according to the M0 through M7 numbering system. This was from the previous French, American, British classification system of acute myeloid leukemias. However, now they are behind the genetic defined acute myeloid leukemias. If we notice the descriptions in each of these terms, such as basophilic or myelomonocytic, we can see and infer that a number of these can be considered by paying attention to the morphology on the slide. Most of these require a threshold of 20% blasts. However, even with 20% blasts, that leaves 80 or so percent of other cells. And the features of the other cells, such as whether they're increased basophils, increased myelocytes and monocytes, can give you a clue as to the specific immunomorphologic category of acute myeloid leukemia where you will land. In this category, we can also include mixed phenotype acute leukemias, B myeloid, and T myeloid. The mixed phenotype acute leukemias include a myeloid component of blasts and or a lymphoid component of blasts. You can have either two separate populations, a myeloid population and a lymphoid population, or a single population of blasts that express either myeloid and B cell markers or myeloid and T cell markers to qualify for the mixed phenotype acute leukemia. A third flavor of acute myeloid leukemia, which we can include in this immunomorphologic category or grouping, is myeloid sarcoma, which is different because it is sheets of blasts that instead of occurring in the bone marrow or peripheral blood, occur as a mass. With that simple description, we go back to our list and there's only a few more left. Those with antecedent or predisposing conditions. I group these in the term history. These include those with genetic predisposition, such as myeloid neoplasms associated with germline predisposition. A couple to keep in mind are DDX41 and TP53 germline mutations. Myeloid proliferations associated with Down syndrome, such as transient abnormal myelopoiesis, which you can see in newborns who are born with Down syndrome. Treatment-related myeloid neoplasm, which occurs a few or several years after treatment for carcinoma or solid tumor typically. And one more, which is not specifically on the WHO list, but I include it because it can also present as with increased blast. And that is a post-myeloproliferative neoplasm blast phase, such as blast phase from CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, or blast phase from a primary myelofibrosis. We can put all these together to come up with a framework of groupings for acute myeloid leukemias, those that are genetic defined, those with immunomorphologic features, and then defined or by history. Putting this into our larger framework, we can consider within the larger term of myeloid neoplasms, the acute myeloid leukemias can be grouped into genetic defined, immunomorphologic, and history. With this in mind, as we consider the top tools for acute myeloid leukemias, I would say the most important tools are fluorescence in situ hybridization, or FISH, the karyotype, and next generation sequencing so we can pull out the genetic defined acute myeloid leukemias. Putting this into a step-by-step process, after you identify blasts and confirm that they're myeloid, showing that you're in the world of, or the continent of acute myeloid leukemias, step one, look for rearrangements, fusions, or mutations. These will be found in your cytogenetics report with karyotype, the FISH report, or next generation sequencing report. If there are no characteristic or defining features within those reports, then simply describe what you see by immunohistochemistry, if you have a core biopsy, or flow cytometry, or morphology. Step three, check the history to see if if there's nothing specific there, check the history to see if there are any genetic predispositions, whether they have been treated previously for carcinoma or solid tumor, or if there is a history of a myeloproliferative neoplasm. We can use this order of steps because the rearrangements, fusions and mutations that are defining in the WHO are all mutually exclusive. If you find one, then you will not find another. Second of all, the immunomorphologic grouping of acute myeloid leukemias are only available if you either don't find characteristic cytogenetic or FISH mutations or fusions, or if you happen to be in an area where you don't have access to those more advanced studies. So in terms of simple diagnosis, that's pretty much it. So how can this be hard? It can be difficult or hard to wait for the cytogenetic FISH or NGS studies. They often typically come days after morphology and flow cytometry. This is because the protocols for cytogenetics and FISH and NGS are just simply longer from a technical perspective compared to flow cytometry and morphology. And so if you are trying to put an AML in a specific category before that information comes out, you will not be able to do so. Sometimes we also don't know the history. So if there was a history of a treated carcinoma, that could influence the final diagnosis. Or if there was a history of chronic myeloid leukemia, that would also influence the diagnosis. Finally, dealing with acute myeloid leukemias can be difficult because of the way that test questions are set up in a fairly impractical, um, fairly impractical appearance. They often put undue weight on morphology, looking for signs and features that are either non-specific or fairly insensitive and may be missing in a number of defined acute myeloid leukemias. They also underestimate the breadth of the clinical differential diagnosis. For example, if you found a acute myeloid leukemia that had increased monocytes, the differential diagnosis is not going to be between 4 different entities, but probably closer to 7 or 8. Or if there are non-specific features within an acute myeloid leukemia, your differential diagnosis will be even broader. And it just simply cannot be specifically subclassified by morphology. These basics in mind, and with this mental map that we have developed, let's go through some cases. Case 1. On the slide, we see blasts. Let's say that they express MPO, and so we've proven them to be myeloid by flow cytometry. What's the next question that we would ask? What does the FISH or cytogenetics reports show? Good. In this case, let's say the FISH report shows a DEC NUP 214 fusion. What would the diagnosis be? Acute myeloid leukemia with DEC NUP 214 fusion. And that's it. Another slide with blasts. Again, let's go through the step-by-step process. Does the FISH show in this case? Let's say it shows a KMT2A rearrangement. What would be the diagnosis? Acute myeloid leukemia with KMT2A rearrangement. These first two examples have characteristic defining genetic alterations. And so the acute myeloid leukemias will be subclassified by those defining genetic mutations or rearrangements. Case 3. Think we get the picture. Except this time our FISH report shows no characteristic rearrangements. The NGS shows no characteristic mutations. And by our differential count, we see there are 43% blasts, 20% myelocytes, and 20% monocytes. Since this lacks defining cytogenetic fusions or rearrangements or defining NGS mutations, we can then go to our immunomorphologic categories or groupings and call that an acute myelomonocytic leukemia. Next case. We again see blasts, and our FISH and NGS reports do not give us any defining information. Except in this case, there is a history of colon adenocarcinoma 4 years ago, and the patient was treated with a topoisomerase II inhibitor. In this case, topoisomerase II inhibitor is one of the treatments that can cause a treatment-related myeloid neoplasm. Notice with this diagnosis, it groups them into myeloid neoplasms. It might present with greater than 20% blasts or less than 20% blasts, but since there is treatment in the history, these are all grouped into the same, into one category. Final case, similar morphologic features, but again, we look to the FISH in history. FISH reports shows no rearrangement. Our NGS shows a JAK2 mutation, not the rearrangement. Again, there are increased myeloid blasts, but in this case, there was a history of primary myelofibrosis that was left untreated. So this is most likely a post-myeloproliferative neoplasm blast phase, or post-primary myelofibrosis blast phase to be more specific. So those are the 3 steps for navigating through the acute myeloid leukemias, 38 in total. After you have confirmed that there are blasts and confirmed that they're myeloid, step 1, look for rearrangements, fusions, mutations in your cytogenetics or FISH or karyotype or next generation sequencing report. If none of those are characteristic, then describe what you see with immunohistochemistry, flow cytometry, or morphology. And then check the history to see if there are other modifying factors, such as whether there is a genetic predisposition, treatment, or history of MPN. Congratulations! We created a mental map of acute myeloid leukemias. Challenge for tomorrow. How many acute lymphoblastic leukemias are you aware of? How could you organize them? Store your responses in a notebook, digital file, or blog. Bring your answers back tomorrow, but until then, Let's blitz.